The mare's breath formed clouds in the cold Wyoming dawn as Clara pressed her face against its warm flank, heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Through the gaps between the horse's legs, she watched the tall figure approach the corral, his boots crunching on frost-covered ground. This was her chance, her only chance. The man moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades working with animals, his weathered hands gentle as he checked each horse. Clara had been watching him for 3 days from her hiding spot in the abandoned barn, noting how he treated his livestock with a respect that most men reserved for people. She had seen him share his own breakfast with a limping colt, had watched him spend an extra hour brushing down an old gelding that the other ranch hands ignored, her stomach twisted with hunger so fierce it made her dizzy. The last of the stale bread she had stolen was gone 2 days ago, and the stream water she had been surviving on did nothing to fill the hollow ache inside her. The bruises on her arms had faded from purple to yellow, but the memory of how she got them burned, as fresh as the day she fled. The farmer stopped near the fence where she crouched, and Clara knew she had to move now. Standing slowly, her legs trembling from 3 days of hiding, she stepped out from behind the chestnut mare. The man's hand went instinctively to his hip, where a well-worn Colt rested in its holster, but he did not draw it. "I'm clean. I'm quiet. Take me with you." The words came out in a rush, barely above a whisper, but they carried the weight of desperation. Clara kept her hands visible, palms open, showing she meant no threat. The morning sun caught the tears she did not realize had started falling, and she wiped them away quickly with the back of her hand. Thomas McKenna had seen plenty of trouble in his 30 years, enough to recognize it when it stood before him in a torn calico dress and bare feet. The girl could not have been more than 20, with dark hair that had once been neatly braided but now hung in tangles around her shoulders. Her green eyes held a wariness that reminded him of wild horses brought in from the range, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. He studied her carefully, noting the way she favored her right side, the careful way she held herself as if movement caused pain. Someone had hurt her, and recently. The protective instinct that had gotten him into trouble more than once in his life stirred in his chest. "Where are you running from?" His voice was steady, neither welcoming nor rejecting, just asking for truth. Clara's jaw tightened. She had practiced this conversation in her head 100 times, but now that the moment was here, the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain Marcus Donnelly and his wandering hands, his threats, his promises that if she did not marry him, he would make sure no decent man in 3 counties would have her? How could she describe the way her own father had nodded along, seeing only the money Donnelly's family name would bring? "Trouble," she said finally, "the kind that follows." Thomas nodded slowly. He had been running from his own share of trouble when he settled on this small spread 20 miles outside of Cheyenne. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it asked no questions about a man's past. He valued that silence, understood the need for it. The girl swayed slightly on her feet, and Thomas realized she was fighting to stay upright. When had she last eaten? When had she last slept somewhere safe? "You got family around here?" "No." The word came out flat, final. Clara straightened her shoulders despite the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle. "Just need passage to Denver. I can work for it. I know horses, no cooking, cleaning. I won't be a burden." Thomas glanced back toward the main house, where smoke was already rising from the kitchen chimney. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, would be starting breakfast soon. She was a practical woman who had helped him through plenty of difficult situations, but she also had strong opinions about young women traveling alone with unmarried men. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. 3 riders were coming up the valley, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual travel. Clara's face went white as parchment, and she took an instinctive step closer to Thomas. "That trouble you mentioned," he said quietly. "It got a name. Donnelly." The name came out like a curse. Marcus Donnelly and his boys. Thomas had heard the name before. The Donnelly family owned most of the land between here and Laramie, and Marcus was known for getting what he wanted one way or another. If the girl was running from him, she had good reason to be scared. The riders were close enough now that Thomas could make out Marcus himself in the lead, his expensive hat and silver-studded saddle marking him as a man who believed money made him untouchable. Behind him rode 2 of his ranch hands, both men Thomas recognized as the type who would follow orders without asking questions about their morality. "Get behind the horses," Thomas murmured to Clara. "Stay low." But it was too late. Marcus had spotted them, and was spurring his mount forward, his face set in the hard lines of a man accustomed to having his way. He pulled up short near the corral fence, his pale eyes moving from Thomas to Clara and back again. "Morning, McKenna," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man who considered himself doing a favor by being polite. "Beautiful day for a ride, don't you think?" Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often served better than words when dealing with men like Marcus Donnelly. "Funny thing," Marcus continued, his gaze settling on Clara like a hawk focusing on prey. "My fiancée seems to have wandered off yesterday evening. Young lady, about 20, dark hair, green eyes, real headstrong if you know what I mean. Sometimes needs a firm hand to guide her in the right direction." Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she kept her mouth shut. Thomas could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Thomas replied evenly. "Been working with the horses since before dawn." Marcus smiled, but it was the smile of a man who enjoyed games where he held all the advantages. "Well, that's curious, because I could have sworn I saw someone moving around your property earlier this morning. Maybe you just haven't looked hard enough." One of Marcus's men started to dismount, clearly intending to search the area himself, but Thomas's voice stopped him cold. "This is private property, Donnelly. You're welcome to sit your horse and talk, but nobody gets down without an invitation." The temperature between the two men dropped noticeably. Marcus's smile faded, replaced by the cold calculation of a man weighing his options. Thomas kept his hands loose at his sides, ready to move if necessary, but his posture remained relaxed. He had learned to fight in places where showing fear was often the same as signing your own death warrant. "Now, McKenna, there's no need for hostility between neighbors," Marcus said, his tone smooth as oil on water. "I'm just looking for someone who belongs to me. Someone who maybe got confused and ran off when she should have stayed put like a good girl." "Don't belong to nobody," Clara spoke up, her voice stronger than Thomas expected. "And I never agreed to marry you or anybody else." Marcus's eyes lit up with satisfaction at finally getting her to speak. "There she is. Clara, darling, you've caused quite a stir back home. Your father's worried sick and the whole town's been talking. A young lady wandering around alone, spending the night God knows where. Well, you can imagine what people are saying." The threat was clear enough. In a place where reputation meant everything, Marcus was telling her that her choices were to come with him willingly or have her name dragged through the mud until no decent person would associate with her family. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest as he watched the girl's face. She understood the implications as clearly as he did, understood that Marcus held all the cards that mattered in polite society. But there was still fight in her eyes, still a spark that refused to be extinguished. "Seems to me," Thomas said carefully, "that if a woman says she doesn't want to marry someone, that ought to be the end of the conversation." Marcus turned his attention back to Thomas, and now there was no pretense of friendliness left in his expression. "This doesn't concern you, McKenna. Clara and I have an understanding, arranged by her father and mine. Legal and proper." "Legal, maybe," Thomas replied. "Don't sound too proper from where I'm standing." The two ranch hands moved their horses closer, and Thomas could see them loosening their gun belts. The morning that had started with such promise was turning dangerous fast, and he found himself calculating distances and angles, preparing for violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. Clara stepped forward, placing herself partially between Thomas and the mounted men. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I won't have blood shed on my account." But as she spoke, Thomas heard something in her voice that made him look at her more carefully. There was resignation there, yes, but also something else. A kind of desperate calculation, as if she was buying time while working out another plan. Marcus's smile returned, triumphant and ugly. "That's my sensible girl. Come along now, and we'll forget this little adventure ever happened." He leaned down from his saddle, extending his hand toward Clara like a king granting mercy to a peasant. But instead of taking it, Clara did something that surprised everyone present. She stepped back, closer to Thomas, and spoke in a voice loud enough for all three men to hear clearly. "I claim right of sanctuary." The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gun barrel. Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, settling finally on barely contained fury. Thomas had heard of the old custom, more legend than law in most places, but still recognized in some of the more remote territories where traditional ways held sway. A woman could claim sanctuary with any man willing to grant it, putting herself under his protection until the matter could be settled by proper authorities or community judgment. That's an old wives' tale, Marcus snarled. No legal standing whatsoever. Maybe not in Denver or Cheyenne, Thomas said slowly, but we're a long way from either of those places. Out here, a man's word still means something, and if a woman asks for protection, well, he let the sentence hang unfinished. Clara turned to face him, her green eyes holding a mixture of hope and terror. Thomas McKenna, I ask you to grant me sanctuary until this matter can be properly settled. Will you? Thomas looked at her, this girl who had appeared out of nowhere with trouble following close behind. He thought about his quiet life, his peaceful routine, the careful distance he maintained from other people's problems. Saying yes would complicate everything, would bring down the wrath of one of the most powerful families in the territory. But he also thought about the bruises on her arms, the fear in her eyes, the way she had stood between him and danger even when she had nothing left to lose. I will, he said simply. Marcus's face turned an alarming shade of red. You're making a mistake, McKenna. A big one. The Donnelly name carries weight in this territory, more weight than you can handle. Maybe, Thomas replied, but my word carries weight too, at least on my own land. The girl stays until this can be settled proper. For a moment, the only sound was the snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through the corral posts. Thomas could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip toward violence at the slightest provocation. Finally, Marcus straightened in his saddle and gathered his reins. This isn't over, McKenna. Not by a long shot. Clara, you think you're clever, but you're just delaying the inevitable. You'll come home with me eventually, one way or another. He wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the valley entrance, his men following close behind. But Thomas noticed that one of them looked back several times as they rode away, as if memorizing the layout of the ranch. When the riders had disappeared over the ridge, Clara's legs finally gave out. She sat down hard in the dust, her entire body shaking with reaction and exhaustion. Thomas knelt beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. When's the last time you ate something? Clara tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come. She wrapped her arms around herself and rocked slightly, as if trying to hold herself together through sheer willpower. Come on, Thomas said gently. Let's get you inside. Mrs. Patterson will have breakfast ready, and you look like you could use some food and rest. As he helped her to her feet, Thomas wondered what he had gotten himself into. Marcus Donnelly was not the kind of man to accept defeat gracefully, and Thomas had just declared war on one of the most powerful families in Wyoming territory. But when he looked at Clara's grateful face, saw the way hope was slowly replacing despair in her green eyes, he found he didn't regret his decision. Some fights were worth having regardless of the cost. The walk to the main house seemed longer than usual, with Clara leaning heavily on his arm. Thomas found himself noticing details he usually took for granted. The way the morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple, the sound of cattle lowing in the distance, the solid feeling of the wooden steps beneath their feet. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in the kitchen doorway, having obviously seen the confrontation from the window. She was a small, compact woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed very little. Well, she said, looking Clara up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with plenty of emergencies in her time. Looks like we've got company for breakfast. Clara started to speak, probably to apologize or explain, but Mrs. Patterson held up a hand to stop her. No talking until you've got some food in you, child. You look half-starved. She turned to Thomas. And you, Thomas McKenna, look like a man who's just stuck his hand in a hornet's nest. Thomas couldn't argue with that assessment. As he watched Mrs. Patterson guide Clara toward the kitchen table, he wondered if he had just made the best decision of his life or the worst. Outside, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the valley once again, but this time it was just his own ranch hands returning from the north pasture. Still, Thomas found himself listening more carefully than usual, wondering how long it would be before Marcus Donnelly decided that words weren't enough. The sanctuary he had granted Clara was real enough in his mind, but he knew it would only be as strong as his ability to enforce it. And Marcus Donnelly was not a man who accepted being told no, especially not by someone he considered beneath his station. As the smell of bacon and coffee filled the kitchen, Thomas realized that his quiet, solitary life was officially over. Whatever came next, it was going to be complicated, dangerous, and probably costly. But looking at Clara as she gratefully accepted a plate of food from Mrs. Patterson, he found himself thinking that some complications were worth it. The kitchen fell into a comfortable silence as Clara ate with the focused intensity of someone who had been truly hungry. Thomas nursed his coffee and watched her careful movements, noting how she ate slowly despite her obvious hunger, as if she had learned to make small portions last. Mrs. Patterson bustled around the kitchen, refilling Clara's plate without comment and keeping the coffee pot warm. When Clara finally pushed back from the table, color had returned to her pale cheeks, and her hands had stopped trembling. She looked around the simple but clean kitchen, taking in the checked curtains at the windows, the gleaming copper pots hanging from hooks, the bunches of dried herbs that Mrs. Patterson grew in her garden. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice stronger now. "Both of you. I know this puts you in a difficult position." Mrs. Patterson snorted, a sound that somehow managed to convey both disdain and affection. "Child, I've been in difficult positions since before you were born. A little more difficulty never hurt anybody worth knowing." Thomas set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "We need to talk about what happens next. Marcus Donnelly isn't going to just ride away and forget about this. He'll be back, probably with more men, and he'll try to make life difficult for everyone here until he gets what he wants." Clara's jaw tightened, and Thomas could see her weighing her options. "Maybe I should just keep running. Head for Denver or Colorado Springs, try to lose myself in a bigger city." "With what money?" Mrs. Patterson asked practically. "And wearing what clothes? Child, you've got nothing but the dress on your back and the pride in your heart. That's not enough to start over in a place like Denver." Thomas had been thinking about the same problem. "She's right. Besides, Marcus has influence in Denver too. His family has business interests all over the territory. If he wants to find you, he will." The sound of boots on the front porch made all three of them freeze. Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but then Jake Morrison's voice called out from the other side of the door. "Thomas, you in there? Got something you need to see?" Thomas relaxed slightly. Jake was his foreman, a steady man in his 40s who had been with the ranch for 3 years. If he was here instead of out with the cattle, something was wrong. "Come in, Jake." The foreman stepped into the kitchen, removing his hat as he noticed Clara. He was a lean, weathered man with the kind of deep tan that came from years of outdoor work, and his gray eyes held the wariness of someone who had learned to expect trouble. "Sorry to interrupt," Jake said, nodding politely to Clara and Mrs. Patterson. "But I thought you should know that Donnelly's men were asking questions in town yesterday. Showed some money around, asking if anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggested they weren't too concerned about getting honest answers," Jake replied grimly. "Word is that Marcus put out the story that his fiancée had some kind of breakdown, ran off in a confused state. Says he's worried about her mental condition, fears she might hurt herself or someone else." Clara's face went white, and her hands clenched into fists on the table. "He's trying to make people think I'm insane." "Smart strategy," Thomas admitted reluctantly. "If people believe you're not in your right mind, they won't listen to anything you say about him. And if someone does help you, he can claim they're taking advantage of a sick woman." Mrs. Patterson made a disgusted noise. "Men like Marcus Donnelly make me ashamed of my own species sometimes. Using people's good intentions against them like that." Jake shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "There's more. Marcus also let it be known that he's offering a reward for information leading to the girl's safe return. $500. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. $500 was more money than most ranch hands saw in 2 years. It was enough to tempt honest men into doing things they might not normally consider. "So now every drifter and desperate man between here and Cheyenne is going to be looking for me," Clara said quietly. "And they'll all believe they're doing the right thing by turning me in." Thomas nodded grimly. "It's a good plan. Turns the whole territory into his search party and makes anyone who helps you look like they're either criminals or fools." The room fell silent as they all considered the implications. Clara was effectively trapped, unable to run without money or allies, and unable to stay without bringing danger down on Thomas and his people. "What about the law?" Clara asked finally. "Couldn't I go to the territorial marshal? Tell him what really happened?" Jake and Thomas exchanged a look. "Marcus's uncle is the territorial judge," Jake said gently, "and his cousin married the sheriff in Cheyenne. The law around here tends to see things the way the Donnelly family wants them seen." Clara put her head in her hands and Thomas could see her shoulders shaking with either exhaustion or despair, possibly both. He found himself wanting to comfort her, but he wasn't sure what words could possibly help in a situation this dire. Mrs. Patterson moved around the table and placed a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder. "Now, child, don't you go giving up just yet. There's always options, even when things look darkest. Sometimes you just have to be creative about finding them." "What kind of options?" Clara asked, looking up with red-rimmed eyes. Mrs. Patterson glanced at Thomas, a look passing between them that spoke of years of shared experiences and mutual trust. "Well, there's the old Apache Trail that runs through the mountains to the south. Not many people know about it anymore, but it leads to settlements in Colorado that are outside Marcus's usual sphere of influence." Thomas frowned. "That trail hasn't been used in years, Mary. It's dangerous even for experienced travelers, and Clara doesn't know the country, which is why she wouldn't go alone," Mrs. Patterson replied matter-of-factly. The implication hung in the air, and Thomas felt his life changing direction again, like a river hitting an unexpected bend. "You're suggesting I guide her through?" "I'm suggesting," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "that a man who grants sanctuary has certain obligations, and that sometimes the only way to honor those obligations is to see them through to the end." Jake cleared his throat diplomatically. "If you're thinking about the southern route, you should know that Marcus has been buying up land along all the main trails, got men posted at most of the passes, supposedly watching for rustlers and horse thieves. The Apache Trail doesn't go through any of the main passes," Mrs. Patterson pointed out. "That's why it's so dangerous, but also why it might work." Thomas stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the mountains that ringed his valley. He had built this ranch with his own hands, carved it out of wilderness, and made it into something he could be proud of. The thought of leaving it, even temporarily, made his chest tighten with an emotion he didn't want to examine too closely, but he also thought about Clara's face, when Marcus had smiled at her like a cat playing with a wounded mouse. Some things were worth more than land and cattle, and the comfortable routine of a solitary life. "How long would it take?" he asked without turning around. 2 weeks, maybe 3 if the weather turns bad," Mrs. Patterson replied, "and that's assuming you can find the trail markers. It's been a long time since anyone used that route regularly." Clara stood up from the table, her movements careful, but determined. "I can't ask you to do that. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect." Thomas turned back to face her, and something in his expression must have warned her that his mind was already made up. "You're not asking. I'm offering." "Thomas," Jake said quietly, "if you leave now with Donnelly watching the ranch, he might decide to make things difficult for the rest of us while you're gone. Then you'll handle it the way we've always handled difficult situations," Thomas replied. "Carefully, but without backing down from what's right." Jake nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but I think you should know that Donnelly's not going to be content to wait and see what happens. Word around town is that he's planning something for tonight." The kitchen went cold despite the warmth from the stove. "What kind of something?" Thomas asked. "The kind that usually involves fire," Jake said grimly. "He's been buying whiskey for his men all afternoon, talking loud about how a man has to protect what belongs to him, no matter what it takes." Clara's face went even paler. "He's going to burn down your ranch because of me." "He's going to try," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference." Mrs. Patterson began moving around the kitchen with the brisk efficiency of someone preparing for a siege. "Jake, how many men can we count on if things get ugly?" "4 of our regular hands, plus myself. Maybe a couple of the neighbors if we can get word to them in time, but I wouldn't count on it. Most folks around here don't want to cross the Donnellys unless they absolutely have to." Thomas did the mathematics in his head. 5 men against however many Marcus decided to bring. Not good odds, especially if Marcus was drunk enough on whiskey and wounded pride to forget about being subtle. "There's another option," Clara said quietly. "I could go with him willingly. Tell him I changed my mind, that I was just scared and needed time to think." "And then what?" Mrs. Patterson demanded. "Marry a man who's already shown you what kind of husband he'll be? Spend the rest of your life walking on eggshells and hoping his temper doesn't turn lethal?" Clara didn't answer, but Thomas could see in her eyes that she had already considered that possibility and found it preferable to getting other people killed on her account. "That's not happening," Thomas said firmly. "We've made our choice, and we'll live with the consequences." The afternoon passed in tense preparation. Thomas and Jake checked their weapons and ammunition, while Mrs. Patterson packed supplies as if they were planning a long journey. Clara helped where she could, but Thomas noticed she kept glancing toward the windows, watching for riders that hadn't appeared yet. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Thomas found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, he had been a man with a simple routine and few complications. Now he was preparing to fight a range war and planning a dangerous mountain crossing with a woman he had known for less than 12 hours. The strangest part was that he didn't regret any of it. Clara had brought chaos into his ordered world, but she had also brought something else. Purpose, maybe, or just the reminder that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. As darkness fell over the valley, Thomas stationed Jake and 2 of the hands at strategic points around the ranch buildings, while he and the remaining men kept watch from the main house. Clara insisted on helping despite their protests, and Thomas had to admit that an extra pair of eyes might make the difference between survival and disaster. The night was unusually quiet, with none of the usual sounds of cattle settling down or coyotes calling in the distance. Even the horses in the corral seemed nervous, moving restlessly and snorting at shadows. "Maybe he changed his mind," Clara whispered from her position by the kitchen window. "Maybe," Thomas replied, but he didn't believe it. Men like Marcus Donnelly didn't change their minds about things like this. They just waited for the right moment to strike. That moment came just after midnight, announced by the sound of horses moving fast through the valley. Thomas counted at least 8 riders, maybe more coming from 3 different directions. Marcus had been planning this carefully, using the darkness and his superior numbers to maximum advantage. "Here they come," Jake called softly from his position near the barn. Thomas checked his rifle one more time and moved to the front window of the house. "Remember," he called to his men, "we're not looking to start a war here, but we're not backing down either. Let them make the first move, then respond accordingly." The riders pulled up just outside the circle of light cast by the house's lanterns, close enough to be heard, but far enough away to make accurate shooting difficult. Marcus's voice carried clearly across the night air, slurred enough to confirm that he had been drinking, but still controlled. "McKenna, I know you can hear me. Send the girl out, and we'll call this whole thing a misunderstanding between neighbors." Thomas opened the front door but remained in the shadows of the doorway. "The girl stays where she is, Donnelly. We had this conversation earlier." "That was earlier," Marcus called back. "Now it's later, and I'm running out of patience." "You've got 5 minutes to send her out, or things are going to get unpleasant for everyone." Clara appeared at Thomas's shoulder, and he could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a forge. "Let me talk to him," she whispered. "No," Thomas replied firmly. "Nothing you say is going to change his mind, and he doesn't deserve the satisfaction of hearing you beg." The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas could see Marcus's men spreading out, surrounding the house and outbuildings. They were professionals, or at least experienced enough to know what they were doing. This wasn't going to be a simple matter of outweighting them. When the 5 minutes were up, Marcus's voice carried across the yard again, colder now and more focused. "Have it your way, McKenna, but remember that you chose this." The first shot came from the direction of the barn, followed immediately by the sound of breaking glass, as one of the house windows shattered. Thomas pushed Clara away from the door and brought his rifle up, searching for targets in the darkness beyond the lantern light. The battle for the ranch had begun, and Thomas found himself wondering if his decision to grant sanctuary was about to cost all of them everything they had. The gunfire erupted in earnest, as Marcus's men found their positions, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Thomas pressed himself against the doorframe and returned fire at a shadow moving near the water trough, satisfaction coursing through him when he heard a curse and the sound of someone hitting the ground hard. Clara had taken cover behind the heavy oak table Mrs. Patterson used for preparing meals, her face pale but determined in the lamplight. Mrs. Patterson herself had disappeared into the back of the house, but Thomas could hear her moving around, probably gathering supplies they would need if this siege lasted until dawn. "Jake, report," Thomas called out during a brief lull in the shooting. "2 men down by the barn," came the reply from somewhere in the darkness. "But they got Tommy pinned behind the tool shed, and I think Bill's been hit." Thomas cursed under his breath. They were already down to 3 effective fighters, while Marcus still had most of his men operational. The mathematics of survival were looking increasingly grim. A new sound cut through the night air, the distinctive whoosh of flames catching hold. Orange light began to flicker from the direction of the hay barn, and Thomas realized that Marcus had moved beyond simple intimidation to outright destruction. "They're burning us out," Clara said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Thomas nodded grimly. Fire was a weapon that couldn't be fought with bullets, and Marcus knew it. Once the hay barn caught fully, the flames would spread to the other buildings unless they could stop them. But leaving the house to fight the fire would expose them to Marcus's guns. "Mrs. Patterson," Thomas called toward the back of the house, "we need to move now." The older woman appeared carrying a canvas pack that looked suspiciously well prepared, as if she had been expecting this possibility. "Back doors clear for the moment," she reported, "but not for long." Thomas made a decision that went against every protective instinct he possessed. "Clara, you and Mrs. Patterson head for the root cellar behind the house. It's stone-lined and should give you some protection. I'm going to help Jake and the boys." "No," Clara said firmly. "We stick together. I won't hide in a hole while you fight my battles for me." The stubborn set of her jaw reminded Thomas of a Mustang he had once tried to break, beautiful and spirited and absolutely unwilling to be controlled. Under different circumstances, he might have admired that quality more openly. "This isn't your battle anymore," he told her. "It became mine the moment I gave you sanctuary." Before Clara could argue further, the sound of splintering wood came from the direction of the front door. Someone was trying to break in, probably counting on the fire to distract the defenders. Thomas swung his rifle toward the sound and waited. Marcus himself appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the growing firelight outside. He had traded his expensive clothes for practical darkwear, and the gun in his hand looked well maintained and frequently used. "End of the line, McKenna," Marcus said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was assured. "Send out the girl, and maybe some of your buildings will still be standing come morning." Thomas kept his rifle trained on Marcus's chest, but he could hear movement from other parts of the house. More of Marcus's men were coming through windows and side doors, surrounding them systematically. "The girl's name is Clara," Thomas replied calmly, "and she's under my protection." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Your protection isn't worth much at the moment, is it? Look around, McKenna. Your barn's burning, your men are pinned down or worse, and you're about to lose everything you've built here." Clara stood up from behind the table, and Thomas's heart lurched with fear for her safety. But instead of surrendering, she did something that surprised everyone in the room. She pulled a small derringer from somewhere in the folds of her dress, a weapon so tiny it had been completely concealed until this moment. The gun was pointed not at Marcus, but at her own temple. "You want me, Marcus?" she said, her voice carrying across the room with crystal clarity. "You can have me dead." The room went absolutely silent, except for the crackling of flames outside. Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, finally settling on a combination of rage and disbelief. "You're bluffing," he said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. "Am I? You've already told everyone I'm mentally unstable. Won't be too hard to believe I finally snapped completely, will it?" Thomas found himself holding his breath, unsure whether Clara was bluffing or deadly serious. The derringer was small, but at that range it would certainly be effective, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she had already made peace with this possibility. "Think about it, Marcus," Clara continued. "If I'm dead, what do you get? A corpse to marry? All those plans your family made, all that land they wanted to acquire through our marriage, gone. Nothing to show for tonight, except burned buildings and dead men." Marcus's gun hand wavered slightly. "Put that down, Clara. We can work this out like civilized people." "Civilized?" Clara laughed, and there was genuine hysteria creeping into the sound. "Do you call this civilized? Burning down an innocent man's ranch because he wouldn't hand over a woman like she was a piece of property?" Thomas could see Marcus struggling with the situation. The man was used to getting his way through intimidation and superior force, but Clara had just changed the rules of the game entirely. Mrs. Patterson chose that moment to reappear from the back of the house, moving with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did. But instead of the pack she had been carrying before, she now held something that made Thomas's eyes widen with surprise. It was a badge, tarnished with age, but still recognizable as the star of a U.S. Marshal. "Marcus Donnelly," Mrs. Patterson said in a voice that carried sudden authority. "You and your men are under arrest for arson, assault, and attempted kidnapping." Marcus spun toward her, his face incredulous. "What kind of game is this, Mrs. Patterson held up the badge where the firelight could catch it. "No game, son. I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Mary Patterson, and I've been watching your family's activities in this territory for the better part of 6 months." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Thomas stared at his housekeeper, the woman who had cooked his meals and mended his clothes, and never given the slightest indication that she was anything other than what she appeared. "That's impossible," Marcus sputtered. "So you're just a housekeeper, a nobody." "Best cover there is," Mrs. Patterson replied mildly. "Amazing what people will say and do when they think you're invisible. Your family's been running roughshod over this territory for years, buying judges and sheriffs, intimidating witnesses, stealing land through fraudulent marriages and forged documents. The federal government finally decided it was time to do something about it." Clara slowly lowered the derringer, hope beginning to replace desperation in her expression. Thomas found his own breathing becoming easier as the immediate threat of her suicide receded. Marcus looked around the room, clearly calculating his options. His men were still in position, and he still held most of the advantages in terms of immediate firepower. But the presence of a federal marshal changed the larger equation significantly. "Even if you are what you claim," Marcus said finally, "you're still outnumbered and outgunned. A dead marshal can't testify against anyone." Mrs. Patterson smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression that Thomas had never seen before. "True enough. But a dead marshal with witnesses is a different story entirely, and I think you'll find that my backup has been watching this whole situation develop." As if summoned by her words, new voices called out from the darkness beyond the burning barn. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons and surrender." Thomas counted at least 4 different voices, possibly more, coming from positions that would have given them clear fields of fire on Marcus's men. The tide of the battle had just shifted dramatically. Marcus's face went through a series of emotions, ending with the cold calculation of a man weighing his chances of survival against his desire for revenge. For a moment, Thomas thought he might choose to go down fighting rather than face the consequences of his actions. But then the sound of his own men surrendering began to filter in from outside, and Marcus's shoulders sagged with defeat. He let his gun drop to the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet house. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. Mrs. Patterson moved to pick up his weapon, her movements professional and efficient. "Oh, I think it is, son. We've got enough evidence to put you and half your family away for a very long time. Fraud, intimidation, assault, arson, attempted kidnapping, and that's just what happened tonight." Clara sank back down into a chair, the derringer still clutched in her hand but no longer pointing at anyone. Thomas could see the exhaustion hitting her now that the immediate danger had passed, adrenaline giving way to the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been running on fear and determination for too long. "Is it really over?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson nodded as she secured Marcus's hands with rope that appeared from somewhere in her pack. "For you, yes. Marcus won't be bothering anyone for a good long while, and the federal government is going to be taking a very close look at all the Donnelly family business dealings." Thomas found himself sitting down as well, the reality of what had just happened beginning to sink in. "How long have you known?" he asked Mrs. Patterson. "About Clara? Since yesterday morning when I saw her watching the ranch from the old barn? About you being the kind of man who would do the right thing regardless of the cost, since about a week after I started working here." The sound of boots on the front porch announced the arrival of the other federal marshals, men in dusty trail clothes who moved with the quiet competence of professional lawmen. They took charge of Marcus with minimal fuss, reading him a list of charges that seemed to go on forever. As they led Marcus away, he turned back toward Clara one last time. "I don't think this changes anything. My family has money, influence, connections. I'll be out before the year's over." Mrs. Patterson shook her head sadly. "No, son, you won't. See, we didn't just come for you. Right about now, federal marshals are serving warrants on your father, your uncle the judge, your cousin the sheriff, and about a dozen other members of your organization. It's what we call a coordinated operation." The look of absolute shock on Marcus's face was almost comical. For the first time in his life, he was learning what it felt like to be truly powerless. After the marshals had removed their prisoners and begun the process of documenting the crime scene, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet. The hay barn was a total loss, but the other buildings had been saved. More importantly, none of Thomas's men had been seriously injured, though Bill would need some attention for a bullet graze on his arm. Clara sat on the front porch steps, watching the sun rise over the mountains and illuminate the smoke still rising from the ruins of the barn. Thomas joined her, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to offer comfort if she needed it. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas considered the question. With Marcus in federal custody and the immediate threat removed, Clara was free to go wherever she wanted, do whatever she chose with her life. The realization that she would probably leave soon created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. "Now you get to decide," he said simply. "No one's going to force you into anything ever again." Clara nodded slowly, but she didn't seem entirely happy about the prospect of unlimited freedom. "I don't have anywhere to go, you know. No family that wants me, no money, no skills that would be useful in a city." "You've got skills," Thomas protested. "You know horses, you can cook and clean, and you've got more courage than most men I've known." A small smile played at the corners of Clara's mouth. "Are you offering me a job, Thomas McKenna?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that neither of them had dared to consider during the crisis. Thomas found himself thinking about how empty the ranch would feel without her presence, how much he had come to value her quiet strength and stubborn independence. "I'm offering you a choice," he said carefully. "You can stay here as long as you want as my employee, or—" He paused, suddenly uncertain about how to express what he was feeling. "Or?" Clara prompted gently. Thomas took a deep breath and decided that after everything they had been through together, honesty was the only option. "Or as something more if you're interested. I know it's too soon to talk about such things, and I know you've got good reason to be wary of men making claims on your future. But I want you to know that the option exists if you ever decide you might want to explore it." Clara studied his face for a long moment, searching for something she seemed to find satisfactory. "I think I'd like to stay for a while," she said finally. "Get to know the real Thomas McKenna, not just the man who granted me sanctuary. And what if you don't like what you find?" Clara's smile widened, and for the first time since he had met her, Thomas saw genuine happiness in her green eyes. "Then I guess I'll have to find somewhere else to hide among the horses." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, warming their faces and painting the valley in shades of gold and green. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway behind them, no longer playing the role of simple housekeeper, but somehow still managing to radiate the same practical competence she had always shown. "Well," she said, surveying the scene with satisfaction, "I'd say that worked out about as well as anyone could have hoped." Thomas turned to look at her, still adjusting to the revelation of her true identity. "What happens to you now? Do you move on to the next assignment?" Mrs. Patterson shrugged. "Eventually, but this case is going to require a lot of testimony and paperwork, and I'll need to stick around for the trials. Besides," she added with a sly glance at Clara, "someone needs to make sure you two don't do anything foolish while you're figuring out what comes next." Clara laughed, a sound that was pure joy after all the fear and tension of the past few days. "I think we can handle things from here, Marshal Patterson. It's still just Mary to you, child, and I'll believe that when I see it." Young people in situations like this have a tendency to either rush into things too fast or run away from them entirely. Neither approach tends to work out very well. Thomas found himself smiling as well, infected by the lighter mood now that the immediate dangers had passed. "Any advice for avoiding those particular mistakes?" Mrs. Patterson considered the question seriously. "Take your time. Get to know each other without the pressure of life and death situations hanging over your heads. And remember that the best relationships are built on partnership, not rescue." As if to emphasize her point, Clara stood up and began gathering the scattered items that had been knocked around during the fight. Thomas moved to help her, and they worked together to restore some order to the chaos, their movements gradually falling into a natural rhythm. Watching them work, Mrs. Patterson nodded with satisfaction. Whatever the future held for Thomas McKenna and Clara, it was going to be their choice to make, free from the threats and manipulations that had brought them together. The sun was fully up now, burning away the last of the smoke and mist from the valley. In the distance, cattle were moving toward the stream for their morning drink, and the familiar sounds of ranch life were beginning to reassert themselves. Thomas looked around at his land, his buildings, his animals, and realized that everything he had worked so hard to build was still here, still his. But more than that, he had gained something he hadn't even known he was missing: Clara finished collecting the last of the scattered papers and stood up, brushing dust from her dress. She looked at Thomas, then at Mrs. Patterson, and finally out at the mountains that surrounded their valley. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think I'm going to like it here." And Thomas McKenna, who had started the week as a solitary man, content with his quiet life, found himself thinking that the best complications were the ones you chose for yourself.